fellow curators. Welcome back to the Curation Station. I'm Brandon Patrick, and today on the show, we're talking Miles Davis. Now, we're talking acoustic Miles Davis, so although this is one of the best-selling jazz records of all time, we're not talking about it today, but we will talk about it in a future episode. No, we're talking acoustic Miles Davis, the early stuff, all the way up until the 60s. So let's go to Sleepy Time Brandon to learn a bit more about Miles Davis.
Oh, what the fuck? How'd you guys get in my bedroom? Okay. Miles Davis was born in Alton, Illinois. He was sort of the ultimate jazz student. He went to Juilliard to study classical trumpet, but since he was in New York, he started popping over to the jazz scene where he started meeting like guys like Charlie Parker and started playing with them. Miles played bebop with Charlie Parker and his group for a while, but he never quite fit into that bebop setting. He could play the fast runs that everyone else played, but Miles' approach to the trumpet was more of a subtle, subdued thing, something we hadn't really seen in the trumpet aside from out of guys like Clark Terry who could do anything with the horn. But Miles wasn't approaching it with the vim and vigor of like a Dizzy Gillespie. He was saying, hey, there's subtleties, there's nuance in this instrument. As I said, he played the trumpet. This is one very similar to one that he would have played. It's just different. Maybe it's heavier, maybe it's lighter, but one of the identifying features of Miles Davis's sound was that he used the Harmon mute. I don't have one similar to the one that he used with me. I didn't bring all my trumpet mutes when I moved out of my parents' house in my early 30s, but this will give you a similar sound. This is actually made to sort of sound more like Miles Davis than a typical Harmon mute, but the sound is kind of marked by the usage of that. It doesn't give you, people hear the word mute and they think it just makes the trumpet quieter, but it gives it sort of a bubbly quality. Yeah. Anything else? All right, well, let's go back to Fully Awake Brandon and see what he's... I'll talk to you in a little bit.
All right, that was informative. Let's get you a nap, buddy. If we're starting to talk about acoustic Miles Davis, there's only one album you really, really need in your collection. And that's this guy, Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album of all time. Now, this is a reissue, obviously, you can tell because how good it looks, but it's similar to the original. Look at that, 1959 over here, 2008 over here. A couple of things to notice, if you do get an older copy, Cannonball Adderley's name, misspelled. So that's kind of cool trivia if you have like an older copy of this album. Some of the newer copies of this album have a couple of extra bonus tracks. An extra take of flamenco sketches is usually included. This one doesn't have that, but sometimes it is included on vinyl just to sort of spice it up. You don't need it. You don't need it. You need the original 5 tracks. So What, All Blues, Freddie Freeloader, flamenco sketches, blue and green. That's what you're looking for. Anything else is just a bonus. But this album, dark, moody, atmospheric. It's got Miles using that Harmon mute like Sleepy Time was telling you about. This is an experiment in modal jazz, which is using scales as a form of improvisation versus chords. I know that chords are scales, just smaller. I don't know. Does modal jazz mean anything to you? It doesn't mean anything to the average person, but that's what's on this album. So I don't know. It's something you could talk about, but I would rather focus on the atmospheric, moody, bluesy music on this album. You've got a young John Coltrane on tenor sax and a young Cannonball Adderley on alto, and I think they're a perfect complement for each other. Cannonball's got that silky, smooth, bluesy sound, and Coltrane is burning through scales at a rate that's, even for this album, kind of unlike what anyone else is doing. He's playing pretty fast. He's playing more melodic than he would on something like Giant Steps, but it's an incredible record. Bill Evans plays piano on most of the tunes. Bill Evans, known for having an amazing touch on the piano, one of the greatest jazz pianists of all time. This is the gold standard for small group jazz recordings. If you're gonna get one Miles Davis record, this has to be the one you get. Now, where do you go from there? What's a hidden gem in the Miles Davis collection? I've got a couple suggestions for you. Roundabout Midnight is sort of what made Miles Davis become a jazz household name. At the 1955 Newport Jazz Festival, Miles played the song Round Midnight by Thelonious Monk, and it was dark, it was moody, it was using that harmon mute, and it was like, oh wow, this is a sound that we haven't heard before out of a trumpet, because it's not that big, brash, Dizzy Gillespie style. And people were like, okay, let's take notice to this kid. Columbia Records signs Miles Davis, even though he's already in a contract with a company called Prestige, and they start just putting out records. This was recorded in 1956, didn't get released till a few years later, I believe, but this record shows the beginnings of that Miles Davis quintet, the same quintet that played at Newport, and they're just gelling. You've got Coltrane, but before he starts doing all the fast runs and all the crazy notes and outside chord stuff, it's a very traditional record, but you find Miles Davis with that harmon mute, and it's a really cool sound. It's sort of a precursor to what is to come on that Kind of Blue record. So if you liked Kind of Blue, this is sort of the prequel to that. Another hidden gem of the Miles Davis early years, milestones. Aptly named, because that's what it is. It's a milestone. You hear Miles Davis, Cannonball, and John Coltrane really interplay a lot together on this record. There's a lot more back and forth, and there's a lot more variance of tempo. So if you found Kind of Blue to be a little bit too slow or too melodic and moody, this has a lot of really fast action runs. So it's got more of a bebop feel, more of a that explosive jazz than a lot of Kind of Blue. It's not as modal based as Kind of Blue is. This is technically an experiment in modal jazz, but it's not as pronounced as on like So What. But if you liked Kind of Blue and you're like, I wish they would kick the tempo up, I wish it was a little bit more dynamic, this is the record for you, Milestones. Now for the final hidden gem, something you might not know. We've talked about Cannonball Adderley and his really bluesy alto sound. Here he is on a record called Something Else. Now Something Else is interesting because Cannonball Adderley is the leader. Miles Davis is a sideman. He's playing with Cannonball Adderley. But it's sort of like that 80s Prince thing where it's like, oh, is Prince doing this? No. Miles Davis arranged and wrote a lot of the songs on this album. Basically just letting Cannonball sort of get the shine because he knew that Cannonball was a great player and wanted to get him in front of as many people as possible. This is an incredible record. Starts off with a song called Autumn Leaves, and it's just Miles and this bass player for a lot of it, and it's kind of sexy, kind of creeping. It's a great tune to listen to. This is a reissue of the original album by our good friends at Wax Time. 180 gram vinyl, super shiny packaging. The original's on Blue Note, looks pretty much identical. This is an easy record to find, but not a lot of people know that this was the last appearance as Miles Davis in a small group setting as a sideman. So that's a little trivia for you, just something spicy to be like, yeah, this is a Miles Davis record, but it's not. It's a Cannonball Adderley record. And for our deep cut, this is an interesting record for a number of reasons, and we're gonna go through as many as we can. Miles Davis, miles ahead. Now, this record you can go out and get. It's not impossible to find. But this version of this record is the true deep cut hidden gem, because look at the cover. White lady on a boat. When Miles saw this, he said, "Who's that white bitch? Get her off the cover." And they changed the cover for all future repressings. This is extremely rare. Trivia. This is the mono version of the album, and this is the version you want. You can get it in stereo, but don't. Miles did overdubs on this album, and if you get the stereo remasters, you can hear the original playing as well as the overdubbed part. That's not what you want. You want this guy, the mono recording. It's unlikely you'll be able to find it affordable with the original cover, but if you can, get it, it's great. Trivia. This is what they used to do to black artists that had crossed over into the mainstream. To not upset whites in the 50s, they would put a white lady on the cover. They wouldn't put the artist on the packaging at all. And so it's like, oh, Miles Davis, he plays for whites, like us. Not me, but us, you. Little Richard had a lot of albums like this. James Brown had a lot of albums like this. If you popped in the 50s and you were successful and famous and crossed over to a white audience, your record label would more than likely put a white person on the front cover of your album to sell it and make it more palatable. It's a dark time in records, but it's what used to happen. Another piece of trivia. Miles Davis on this recording does not play the trumpet. He plays what's called a flugelhorn. Yeah, so it's the only time he ever played one. It doesn't sound tremendously different from a trumpet. It's played the same way as a trumpet, but it's a little bit more mellow. It's a little more stuffy, but he's playing it with a trumpet mouthpiece, it sounds like. So it kind of sounds like a crossover between a trumpet and a flugelhorn. Little trivia there. An instrument was created called a flumpet that's between a trumpet and a flugelhorn. Nobody really has them. There's like 100 that exist, and most of them are prototypes, and it doesn't matter. Miles ahead. Another cool thing about this album is it's Miles Davis with a big band orchestrated by a guy named Gil Evans. Gil Evans and Miles would work together on Sketches of Spain, Porgy and Bess, and an album called Quiet Nights that neither of them was really excited about coming out. But this is orchestral Miles, and as we spoke with Sleepy Time earlier, Miles was a Juilliard student. He was a classically trained trumpet player. So this finds him in that classical setting as well as in a jazz context. So it's a big band, it's a lot of horns, it's a lot of reeds, and they're playing very tightly, intricately organized music, but in a very jazzy feel. This doesn't sound like any of the moody Miles Davis stuff we talked about with the small groups, but this is a great record to have to show sort of the range of the guy, even before he hit his electric period. Not a lot of guys were willing to experiment with bands this big. This is 19 other players, but Miles was always pushing boundaries. So if you get this album, get it on mono, and if you can find this original cover, even better. You've got that little racial trivia to pass on to your friends. And that's it. So my recommendations, if you're gonna get 3 Miles Davis records in the acoustic period, Kind of Blue, number 1. If you have to get one, this is the one record to get. It's incredible, moody, atmospheric, a lot of harmony mute, a lot of subdued playing, a lot of atmosphere, a lot of amazing chords by Bill Evans, who's really great at that, and really cool doing some rhythmic displacement, which you'll hear a lot of. Second album, I think you've got to get this Deep Cut by Cannonball Adderley. Something else. It's an incredible record. It's Miles Davis with a small group. Cannonball's leading the charge, but it sounds amazing. It's more of a Miles Davis record than a Cannonball record, but it's a great look for both of them. Highly recommend it. Can't get enough of this album. And finally, Miles Ahead. If you can get it on mono, get it on mono. If you can get it with this original cover, get it with the original cover. The other covers are cool, but this one is gonna give you a lot to talk about. This is a total hidden gem, but when people see this in your collection, they're gonna have some questions, and thanks to this show, you're gonna have some answers. That was Curate this week. Next week, we're talking about different stuff. I don't remember exactly what is on the agenda, but you will find out when we all find out. Thanks for watching.